Coffee, Cows, and Crops is produced by the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association and hosted by Extension Coordinator Johanna Murray. On this podcast, we discuss management practices and research results with scientists, ranchers, researchers, and farmers. We strive to share innovative information and farming practices supported by sound science and practical wisdom. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get learning. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Coffee, Cows, and Crops. Today I'm chatting with Mike Dorion from Living Soil Solutions about composting and setting up an urban farm in Calgary. But before we get into all the fun stuff, Mike, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you got into all this soil health stuff?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so it would have been about 2011 or so. I finally got to being an urbanite. I finally got a chance to move to a place that I could have a garden, and somebody was like, "Hey, before you do that, you should take a course at the Calgary the Calgary Horticultural Society because you'll have to learn about Chinooks." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I went down there and took the course and learned quite a bit. But then I met a lady there, and I sure hope I run into her again because I can't remember who it was. But we were chatting, and she told me to look into this this company called Vermiculture, and it was all about permaculture design and all that. And I went and checked their website, and I was like, "Whoa, this is exactly kind of what I want to look into right now." So I had the opportunity to jump in on their design certificate, their next one, and it was out in Nelson for like a 2-week intensive. So straight to Hippieville for a permaculture course. So it was very fitting. And yeah, that kind of got me immersed. So I took a handful of courses after that. And then that fall, they brought this gentleman named Doug Weatherby. He was calling himself the soil doctor, and he'd come up from Mexico. But he was a dude that had actually originally grown up in Toronto. And he did this 4 days of soil. And we talked about composting and compost extracts and teas and then a lot of the biological portions of the soil. And I was hooked. And I remember like writing in my little binder there, like a little truck with a tank on it. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to start spraying people's yards and gardens." And one of my good friends of my family was in the same course with us, and he had his 4-year soil science degree. And he was like, "Whoa, I learned more in these 4 days than I did in those 4 years." So that kind of helped like lay the gauntlet down of like, okay, all right, so I think I'm on the right track here. So I kind of put the word out, and then that spring I started getting phone calls, and people were looking for some natural options for their fertilizing or amending their soil, and that's kind of where I started.
That's awesome. All right, so I guess to start us off, what is compost and what sort of things does it do in soil?
Oh, that's a big question there, Joanna. I could talk on this for like half a day. Well, we'll try to keep it simple. So compost is essentially organic streams that are broken down. So I'm not talking like certified organic. I'm talking about living things. So we're essentially taking dead things and making life out of it again. And essentially it becomes pretty close to something that would happen in a forest or a native prairie if we let it sit for multiple years. It becomes that kind of rich, crumbly soil, or that humus that's kind of keeping soil correct. So that's definitely the key point, is making sure that it's aerobic and it's alive. There are a couple ways of doing anaerobic styles of composting, but they're just a little bit different, and you're definitely getting a different substrate or a different product on the back end. Mm-hmm. So the main point is aerobic and alive. And then putting it to use. So I think that for the longest time, we've seen people using compost just to kind of improve or increase their organic matter. But I think where we're going to start to see some more interest and more more uses for compost, especially as people can start to showcase that it's just not rotted horse manure or rotted cow manure or something like it. There's definitely some tests and work that's put into it to showcase all the little critters and microbes in it. Then we can start to use it as more of an inoculant. So not just bringing that organic matter that helps feed the organisms and gives those organisms something to nibble on when they're not associating with the plant, but then also bringing that much more diversity of critters into the soil. So we talk about in some of the regenerative principles, the management styles of having crop diversity. Well, we also want to have diversity of organisms, because then we're going to have a higher chance that that plant is going to have an organism in that soil profile that's going to be able to help in whatever condition that plant's going to need, whether, you know, the pH starts to change or the moisture changes or it gets too hot or too cold, or maybe it needs a certain nutrient, or maybe a certain pathogen or pest comes in and it can start to keep it at bay. So the higher the diversity we have in the soil, the higher the chance we're going to have the organisms to do that. And good quality compost can have the opportunity to do that.
Cool. Well, that makes sense. So I know, speaking of good quality compost, there are some specific requirements to kill things like weed seeds or pathogens or any of that sort of stuff, as well as just to produce something that's consistent. So what are the requirements for good compost?
Yeah. So when we look at making sure that we're taking care of some of those stipulations, the best way to treat or manage your compost then would be to create a thermophilic pile. And what that means is getting it up to a certain temperature. So we would call that hot composting. So that's basically whatever we're using to flip our pile, and then making sure we have some kind of thermometer so that we can track the level of the heat that's being produced. And that heat is essentially coming from, you know, the organisms are reproducing. They're getting down and dirty, so they're going to produce a bit of heat, you know. This is just one of those off streams. So when we get it above 55 degrees Celsius, I believe that's like kind of in the 140, 160 Fahrenheit range, then what happens there is that's when we have weed seed kill, and then we'd also have pathogen kill. So we're starting to essentially destroy anything that's going to have a negative impact on putting it back into the soil. So once we get it above that 55 degrees, weed seeds can handle it. It'll take out any of those fecal coliforms, so like Salmonella or E. coli. So anything that like a bacteria that would make us sick. So that 55 degrees would eliminate that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then depending on what kinds of feedstocks or ingredients that we're putting within our compost pile, we'd also then want to check on, so this is mainly probably going to apply to more of like post-consumer organics, like stuff coming from restaurants or just people's houses. So there is a couple of farmers that are starting to work with more of that or doing that kind of composting on site, like Stickland down by Sylvan. And then you're going to want to check for like contamination stuff, whether that's going to be a certain amount of plastics or metal or glass or anything like that, just so that you're not having high levels in case that does end up, somebody getting cut or poked or a certain amount of other trash going back into the soil where it's supposed to go and fix the problem, not make it worse again. So. And I'll give a little side note there, because I know a few people have talked about, so that's basically the only stipulations that you need to do right now to classify it. It'll give you like a class A or a class B rating to then be sold depending on whether it's being used for food or edibles or more for perennials and kind of reestablishment of plant material. But a few colleagues have put it out there that it would be neat because there's so many composts out there, but what is actually classifying them as a compost or not? Or are they just more like organic matter? Because like, I've had a few places that I've seen that are selling compost, but then they sterilize it before they sell it. So they don't have any life in it. So then then that's not really compost. So just to try to make those definitions, but also to maybe hold the whole industry or what compost is to a standard so that, this is where we draw the line in the sand of what the quality needs to be. And then anything above that is golden, so that client is, or that composter is getting the value that they need. But I digress. So we go back. If a really simple way to kind of make sure that we have something that's quality is we could take what they call a cucumber test. So say you take like 100 seeds and you use an amendment that that you'll get a certain amount of germination, then that product, if you want to sell it as compost, needs to get something similar. So say it was like 80%, you'd have to have 80% and then be like, okay, we've got good germination. That means we can get good seeds doing their thing, but then we'll be able to get a certain amount of energy out of that for the continued plant growth. And if they can't, then it's just organic matter. And then that would be kind of a real simple way to cut to the chase on that.
Yeah. So another note, and you kind of touched on this, is that compost can be made out of a lot of different materials, whether that's cow manure or, baked goods that have gone stale or vegetables or whatever, or dead stock. Like you can put anything in there. So do different ingredients, I imagine they do affect nutrient content a little bit, but do they have any sort of significant effects on like the effectiveness of the compost or maybe the applications you might use it for?
Yeah, 100%. Like that's why the Compost Council of Canada has been really adamant about this. Is like, compost is not compost is not compost. So it's going to depend on what kind of style of composting that you're doing. Are you doing an aerated static pile and you never really move the pile, you're just blasting air through it, or are you flipping it on a regular, or is it going through an anaerobic biodigester? Like those are three different methods. But then also it's going to depend on what you're putting in there. So most compost piles kind of break down in kind of 4 ingredients. Like you need your oxygen, you need your water. So those are going to help those organisms do their thing. But then it breaks down into what either we call greens or browns. So those are the other ingredients, but I like to call them nitrogen and carbon. So the green would be nitrogen and the browns would be carbon, because people will get really locked on colors and they'll take something like coffee grounds and be like, oh, it's brown in color, so it must be a brown. But it actually has a higher level of nitrogen to it. So it would be more of a nitrogen or a green source. Kind of, I call coffee grounds like the urban manure. So if you're making a compost pile, say just out of, you're cleaning the pens and, you've got maybe straw, hay, and manure in there, that is going to be a very different compost than say you're using wood chips and food waste with brewer grains and coffee grounds and maybe some, cut grass and stuff in there. They're going to be very different. So yeah, they're going to have a different biological makeup to them, but then they're also going to have a different kind of nutrient breakdown too. Mm-hmm. So that's where I think in this world, as we move forward of measuring our soil and measuring our compost, then we can start to match up to fill in those blanks where we're missing out, right? Mm-hmm. And then even like I've got a friend who does vermicomposting, and he's got clients that are starting to look for, okay, well, we need more calcium and more phosphorus in our soil for, we're growing tomato plants. So he's able to figure out different ingredients to feed the worms, and that nutrient shows up in a form in the end product in the worm castings that now they can get that better pull for their crops.
Cool.
So that's when you can really start geeking out and like, okay, all right, what do I need in here? What can I add to my compost pile to make sure that it's locked up in that product afterwards?
Yeah, that's really cool. I know we've started to see a lot of compost teas around. We've actually got a fella who's doing some of this vermiculture and making his own compost teas. We're actually doing some data collection on it, but we just started on that last year. So I'm keen to see what happens there.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. But on that note, can you talk about like why you might use a compost tea as opposed to like a solid compost or even worm castings?
Yeah, for sure. So when using the compost or just the straight castings, the added bonus that you're going to get out of that instead of using it as an extract or a tea would be you are getting that organic matter. So you're getting some more physical biomass that you're adding to your soil or to your plot. Where I think the extracts and the teas are going to become a lot more popular is just one, it's going to come down to, okay, do you have the equipment? Most farmers already have some kind of a liquid package equipment to spray stuff out. So there's not much tweaking there to change those. But then it's going to be a lot more cost effective too. Like I've got a couple farmer buds out by Westlock that are, they're spreading out 10 ton on a field, but they have the equipment to do that because that's actually a service that they provide. But maybe, not everybody might have a manure spread or anything like that. And maybe that's just more of a, that barn raising kind of mentality of farmers helping farmers in the communities a little bit more and not going, well, you're doing something different than me. And I don't want to talk to you because you're a weirdo, but like, we're all trying to grow stuff together. So sometimes it's just going to be done a little differently. So the teas and extracts are going to be a little bit, so the extracts are really good for doing more of a soil soak, so really good in the beginning of the season and maybe at the end of the season to help with residue breakdown. And then the compost teas are really good where you can start to get a bit more of stickiness within the solution so that it works better as a foliar application. So I think the fun with it is one, you can start to add in ingredients into the solution to change what you're looking for again, depending on what the crop needs and to help protect them from different diseases and pests and pathogens as well. But then, you can also tweak it on the biological side on depending on what you want to try to tweak for. Are you switching to more of a perennial crop, or are you going to put in a forage that you want to last a couple of years instead of annuals? So then you can start to tweak what that looks like and change the succession of the land a little bit quicker too. So I think just the liquid side is just a little bit more bang for your buck. So yeah, you get a little bit more tailored. Let's use that. You can tailor it a little bit differently for your needs. So right. I think that's always a bonus for farmers because, you never know, things are changing so quickly.
For sure. Yeah, well, and every farm's a little bit different.
Exactly, right? It all comes down to context, doesn't it?
For sure. I guess from there, the next natural question is, what do you think is kind of the most important thing for people to know when they're getting into composting or vermiculture or even these teas for their soil health?
Yeah, the biggest one is the testing side, and always keep notes. I've been adamant about this, is like keep notes so that if you did something and it worked, then at least then you can go back in your notes and go, oh, this is what I did, or this is the ratios of ingredients that I used, or how come all my worms died? It was like, oh, I put this in. Maybe it wasn't right for them or something, right? Yep. So the note taking and then the testing just to make sure that you're doing your due diligence. And I think this is, and you could probably speak on this as well. I'm starting to see definitely it's becoming more of an annual, biannual, or even multiple times throughout the season. Just from soil sampling to doing tissues or sap analysis and that kind of stuff, that most farmers are starting to get a bit of a baseline of where they're at and creating some end goals of where they can take it. So I would do the same thing with the compost and the teas and stuff like that as well.
That makes sense. It just makes me think of, I think it's Adam Savage. Yeah, if you're fucking around and you take notes, then it's research. But if you just fuck around and don't take notes, then it's just fucking around.
Yeah, 100%.
So I guess now we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about this other project that you're part of, that I think is really interesting, because you're part of the Highfield Regenerative Farm, which started in 2019 on a vacant lot in Calgary. And you guys are growing your food. I saw you've got a greenhouse going up over there. Like, can you tell me a bit about that project and how it got started?
Yeah, you bet. So Highfield Regenerative Farm kind of was, it started as a pilot program with the city of Calgary, part of their Calgary Eats program. So essentially looking at kind of food sovereignty, but then also like food desert and distribution side of things within urban communities. So you can do like this map and like find out where all these grocery stores are, but then there's certain communities that don't have as much access, and it's mainly just convenience stores and stuff. So how can we change that within the space of the city? So we ended up partnering with the Compost Council of Canada as our nonprofit for the project, and we put in and we got it. And it's one of their larger parcels. So the city has multiple of these that they would like to slowly transition over. But the idea was to take vacant land that's within the city limits, that's not doing anything. So there's a lot, which is crazy to me. Or maybe they're spending money on cutting grass or spraying weeds for nobody's use, which is crazy to me as well. And so we're doing soil rejuvenation. That's another good reason why we partnered with the Compost Council of Canada. So how can we compost local or decentralized waste streams within the area to rejuvenate that land? And then let's grow food there. So that's a big part of what we're doing there as well. And then let's build community around that. So more people coming together, getting their hands in the soil, dealing with local waste streams, learning about how to take care of the soil, how to keep it healthy, but then how that relationship works in growing good, healthy plants. And then what can we do with those plants besides just eat them? Well, we can share and give them out to others that might not be able to have the affordability or access to them as well. And then that just even tightens and broadens that experience. And so, yeah, it's been one heck of a project, let me tell you. But it's been going really, really good. We're in the aspect of putting in our application to actually do like a full scale compost operation there, just to showcase what like a mid-scale operation would look like. Because there's lots of little tiny ones and then really massive ones, but there's not that many kind of in the middle side of things. And then we've got a good garden plot where we get tons of volunteers coming out and lots of students coming and volunteering and helping with different things. We've got beehives on site, so that's an opportunity for people to come and chuck on the suits and get familiar and more comfortable with the bees. And then we've got a lady that is she grows mushrooms and kind of microgreens and greens for restaurants, but then she set up a big hoop house growing edible flowers, like all kinds of different edible flowers. It's so beautiful. And then we with Agri Food Canada last year, we won a grant to get a greenhouse. So we've got a greenhouse up, and it took a little longer to get all the bells and whistles kind of in place and permits and all that kind of thing. But we were able to start getting plants in there kind of early March. And it's so neat to kind of to walk in there now and to feel the humidity that's starting to produce in there and the smells and the lushness. So that's going to be kind of our teaching space / growing space, and then be able to use that as kind of a workshop education thing too, because we can start to showcase just growing in soil, but then all the different ways of growing too, vertically and hydroponically, and aeroponically, and then what's the other one with the fish, aquaponics. So just being able to show all the different methods so that it, that'll again come down to context. If people want to come down and they only have so much space, or they have an idea of what they want to do, now they can kind of play with it and see it real world and get their hands a little bit dirty and go with it. So it's been a lot of fun, and we have the quite a few little events. Like at the end of the month, we're having a mud fest, because actually one of our members is they're called Common Digs, and they run like a nature kind of kindergarten and preschool. So the kids get to just hang outside and do their learning and stuff that way. So they're building forts and stuff in the little forest and everything. But yeah, we're having a mud fest. We're encouraging people to come and get downright dirty. There's going to be like a mud pit and a mud slide, mud kitchens and stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And and then the one really huge success that we've seen from this so far, like we donate a lot of food to different food security groups, and that's always a beautiful thing. But we started, and this is just because I'm more of a geek on it, but to tie in what we were chatting about earlier, we started a compost club. So we just had people coming out, wanted to learn how to make compost, and we had a few of us that were quite keen on showcasing that and teaching that. And now a few of them have just taken it completely over, and they've started like a compost co-op, and they're starting to do workshops and stuff. But it's a group that comes almost 2 to 3 times a week now to the farm and is turning and making compost piles. They did almost 21 tons of compost last year. And when you get a group of 15 to 20 people showing up each time, you can flip a compost pile pretty darn quick, let me tell you.
Yeah, I bet.
So that has been so cool to see. And that's the really neat side, where you can start to see people coming together over commonality and just sharing space and laugh and fun and knowledge and making compost at the same time.
There you go.
Yeah, we call them talk and turns. You get together and talk and turn a pile.
There you go. That's awesome. So on the compost note, I guess, so the farm's set up on some vacant ground, and I imagine that means it's pretty tough as soil goes. So what kind of changes have you seen in soil on the site while you've been working there, just growing stuff and doing compost?
Yeah, so that is a neat portion of this plot of land that we took over. So it was actually classified as what's called a brownfield. So because the property was labeled as industrial commercial, and they were unsure of some of the history of it, they kind of, for liability reasons, has to call it a brownfield. So we're not actually growing in the ground as of yet. Mm-hmm. So what we've done to start to remediate and rejuvenate the soil is we covered majority of the site in 6 inches minimum of wood chips. So that becomes our barrier between kind of the dead, beat up, compacted dirt that's there. Now we get to a mass that starts to hold moisture. We've inoculated. I spray a lot of it with extracts and stuff too, so that we can start to increase that decomposition and get some life in there. And then we put soil in our compost as beds on top of that. It's been interesting and a good experience to learn, because you'll see that in some people's backyards. This has become a common thing of like lasagna gardening or lasagna mulching, where they put multiple layers of organic matter on top of the existing grass to then start their garden, instead of like tilling it all up and starting fresh that way. So we're doing something similar that way. And I'm going to be planting out a couple trial plots this year using different cover crops on the existing native soil that's there. So not much of soil, but then adding a little bit of a layer of compost and then putting some stuff on top for cover crop seeds, and then just see what kind of a difference that can make within a season. Mm-hmm. And then areas that have had mulch on it for a couple of years now, start digging those up and see, has the compaction layers changed? Have we started to build some organic matter? Is there even some biological life in there to see how fast that can get changed? But also a way to use a ton of wood chips that arborists are bringing us all the time.
That's neat. So I guess on that note, what's kind of on your list of goals for that site in the next couple of years?
Yeah, for goals, so the big one will be, or two big ones will be to get that greenhouse going as like a full-on system. So it's been a learning curve for a lot of us. A few of us have had some experience with greenhouses, but just to really get familiar with it and what we could get done in there on, I guess, more affordable side, because as we all know, the price of natural gas and all that has gone quite up. But I've been in chats with some guys on doing, because we're getting the wood chips, does it make sense to use a boiler system burning wood chips? And then, then that's just kind of a biomass side of things, because we're collecting it as a waste stream anyway. Or do we go geekier and create large compost piles and pull heat from that to help mitigate some of the heat in the greenhouse for the winter? There's a cool company out of Vermont that's doing some of that. So, we've got some connection pieces there. So that would be really fun. Get that compost facility done and making some compost would be high on my list. And then just a little side one, because when we took this piece of property over, it didn't have any infrastructure in for water or power. So we were able to bring power over from the one road, and there was a pole already there. So we were lucky that was existing. It was expensive, but it kind of had to be done. But then we don't also have water infrastructure. So we've been pulling water from fire hydrants and then filling tanks and running hoses and stuff all over the place. So it would be really nice to maybe get a plan in place with a company that can assist us with that, and then fundraise for putting that in. Because I think once we had that in place, then we can accept so many more members and stuff to come in and make use of the space, because right now water's been our biggest kind of holdback, just because of how much time and labor it takes to do that. And we only have so many volunteers that show up. You kind of have to focus them on whether it's taking care of the plants or the soil or moving water around a lot too. So.
Right. That makes sense. Is there anything we've missed that you'd like to discuss before we kind of wrap up here?
No, nothing yet. Or maybe I'll give a shameless plug for a program that I'm working on with the Compost Council. So we're putting together this program called the Soil Safari. So it's essentially taking a lot of the visual soil assessment kind of ideas and turning it into a workshop to make it fun and educational for adults and kids to get their hands dirty, but more comfortable with recognizing what their soil is, what is soil, and how can we keep it at that level that will tie into those points that are aligned with regenerative agriculture's management principles, right? So I think that's going to be kind of a fun thing. I'm going to put it out to all you research groups there once I get it going, and see if we can't do that as a regular to just take some of this stuffy, soil is so boring, but make it a little bit more fun and approachable to get all kinds of people at different levels, because the soil is so important, and compost is definitely a really good way to give back to it. But I think, like, my little tagline is soil doesn't like to be treated like dirt. But, how many times do we kind of forget about it? But it's like our main resource of everything. So especially as a farmer, and we just need to get more people familiar with that, especially in the big cities, because I definitely see the discrepancies between my rural friends, my urban friends. That's for sure.
I bet. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for recording this episode with me. If people are looking for more info on the Highfield farm or composting in general, do you have some resources or sites that they should look up?
Yeah, they can check out highfieldfarm.ca. And then I believe on Instagram, it's Highfield Regenerative Farm. And then we're at Living Soil Solutions or livingsoil.ca. Council of Canada's site is compost.org, and there's a ton of info and resources on there as well.
And that's Compost Council of Canada? Sorry, you cut it a little bit.
Yeah, Compost Council of Canada. You betcha.
Perfect. Well, that's awesome. I will drop the links to those down in the description of the podcast so people can check them out. And yeah, thank you very much for doing this. I learned some things about compost today, so that's exciting.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Joanna.
Peace Country Beef and Forage Association is a research and extension group based out of Fairview, Alberta. Our mission is to help producers thrive in an agricultural system that is profitable, regenerative, and attractive to future generations. To learn more about what we do and see the results of our research trials or our archive of newsletters and fact sheets, check out our website at peacecountrybeef.ca. Want to get in touch? Have a burning question or a topic suggestion? Send us a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Thanks for listening.